Before we get into today's passage, I need you to do a little self-identification for me, okay? Do you consider yourself an optimist or a pessimist? And if you're struggling to figure out, I'm guessing the person sitting next to you probably knows. But I'm going to give you a little test. And if you're a pessimist, you might call yourself a realist. That's okay, if you prefer that term. So I'm going to give you a little test. Here, I'm going to give you a series of pictures. This one's the most famous. When you see this, do you see a glass that's half full or a glass that's half empty? Or if you're an engineer, you might say you see a glass that's 50% too big. Let me give you another one. This will help you determine if you're an optimist or a pessimist. What do you see when you see this symbol? Do you see partly sunny or do you see partly cloudy? Or how about this one? What do you see in this picture? Do you see a field of healthy grass or do you see it's time to mow the lawn? This will help you know which you are. Here, I'll give you one last one. What do you see? Do you see a great deal? Or do you see terrible customer service? As you can imagine, of the people that followed Jesus, there was the full spectrum of personalities. From the optimists like John and Peter, Peter, Jesus, you're walking on the water, I'm going to come do it too. All the way to the complete other side of the spectrum, those who are quite pessimistic, probably most famous, the person we're going to look at this morning, Thomas. We frequently call him Doubting Thomas, and we'll see from the passage that we're going to look at this morning. But that's really not his most pervasive characteristic. If you look through the Gospels, really it's his pessimism. That's what leads to his skepticism in the passage we're going to see. He is a glass half empty kind of person. If we were to use today's words, we would call him a worrywart. He's always anxious. He's very negative. He's filled with angst. He'd be like Eeyore in Winnie the Pooh. He anticipates the worst all the time. And outside of the passage that we're going to look at this morning, we really only have two snapshots from his life. If you look through the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, his name only appears once, and it's in the list of all 12 disciples. So we don't really learn anything about Thomas from those books. But in the book of John, we get three little snapshots, the passage we're going to see, and then two other sort of one-liners. And from these one-liners, we can learn a lot about Thomas. So I just want to show you these briefly. It'll give us some context on him as we get into the passage this morning. The first mention of Thomas comes in John chapter 11. And that's the chapter where Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. Well, to give a little context, in John chapter 10, Jesus is actually in Bethany with Lazarus and his family, and there's so much persecution from the Jewish leaders that Jesus and his disciples, they leave Jerusalem. They have to go on the other side of the Jordan. It says Jesus is ministering there, and many people are coming to him. It's probably the most fruitful time of Jesus' ministry. Except all that ends when Jesus finds out that his friend Lazarus is sick. And, that's going to mean going back to Bethany, which is right outside Jerusalem. Probably Jesus getting arrested, maybe killed. The disciples try really hard to talk Jesus out of going. And when they find out that they can't do that, they can't talk him out of it, here's what Thomas says. Then Thomas, also called Didymus, which means twin, he said to the rest of the disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Now that's pessimistic, right? But it's really heroic pessimism. All Thomas could see was disaster ahead. If we go back to Bethany, if we go right outside Jerusalem, it's not going to go well. And yet he's determined to go with Jesus. It's actually easier for optimists to be devoted because they always think it's going to go well. But to be pessimistic and to be devoted, we have to admire his courage. He didn't want to live without Jesus. In essence, he's saying to the other disciples, guys, let's just suck it up. Let's go and let's be prepared to die with him. Better to be with Christ and die with him than to be separated from him. Profound love. The second scene where we see Thomas's profound love for Jesus, it shows up in John 14, a few chapters later. Jesus is in the upper room with his disciples, and Jesus is telling him, hey, I'm getting ready to leave. I'm going to go, I'm going to prepare a place. And he says, you know the place to where I'm going. And then Thomas says this. He says, Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how can we know the way? Again, we see his pessimism. Basically he's saying, you're leaving and we're never going to be able to find you again. We don't even know how to get there, so how are we supposed to get there? A much better plan would be for us to die with you. At least then we can be together. But if you go, how are we going to find you? We don't even know the way. He's a man of deep love. His relationship with Jesus was so strong that he didn't ever want it to be severed. So it's just breaking his heart to hear Jesus talk about leaving. He becomes so attached to Jesus. He can't imagine living life without him. His love and devotion for Jesus is quite admirable. But then Thomas's worst fears come true. Jesus dies, and Thomas doesn't. And he's forced to live without Jesus. And that sort of brings us to our passage today in John chapter 20, if you want to turn with me there. And as we work through this passage this morning, I've sort of given three headings to the interaction that Thomas is going to have with Jesus as we sort of work through that encounter. We'll talk about some of the big ideas under each one. But the first few verses of this encounter could be summed up like this: the cry of a disappointed skeptic. Verses 24 and 25. Now, some context. This is about 3 days after Jesus died on the cross. The disciples are all together except for Thomas. Look at verse 24. It says, now Thomas, who's also called Didymus, the twin, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. And it's really too bad, because if you read the paragraph before Jesus shows up, he appears to the 12, he shows them his hands and his side, and the disciples are ecstatic. They're overjoyed, but Thomas, he missed the whole thing. Where was Thomas? We're not really told, but it's not that hard to really put it all together. Why wasn't Thomas there? Well, the consistent personality we've seen through the several different times we see Thomas is that he's this pessimistic and melancholy person. So when Jesus dies, he's absolutely destroyed. I mean, he's probably somewhere wallowing in his own misery. He could only see the worst of everything, and his worst fear had just come true. So Jesus was gone, and Thomas was sure he'd never see him again. So he loved Jesus so deeply, his heart is being torn out. He's in no mood to socialize, even with his friends. He's heartbroken, he's shattered, he's devastated, he's crushed. He just wants to be alone. He didn't even want to be with his own friends. So his friends find him. After Jesus shows up, they come and they find Thomas and they say, we've seen the Lord. But Thomas doesn't want to hear it. And here's his famous line. He says, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. And this is sort of the famous line that gives him the nickname Doubting Thomas. But before we're too hard on Thomas, let us remember that every one of the disciples needed to see the risen Christ before they believed. None of them believed before Jesus showed up. I remember a couple weeks ago we talked about Mary Magdalene. She was the first to see Jesus. She then ran to the disciples. And look what Mark 16 says. It says she went and she told those who'd been with him and who were mourning and weeping. When they heard that Jesus was alive, that she had seen him, they did not believe it. Then next, Jesus appeared to the two on the road to Emmaus. Look what it says about them. These returned. They reported it to the rest, and they did not believe them either. They all doubted. They all were very slow to believe. And yet Thomas gets the nickname. I'm pretty sure he's not very happy about that. They're all in the same boat until they saw Jesus with their eyes. But Thomas doubts here. Now, what kind of doubt is this in verse 25? You can put 25 back up. He says, unless I see the nail marks in his hands, put my finger where the nails were, and my hand into his side, I will not believe. What kind of doubt is this? This is a little different than the doubt that many have today, where we sort of distrust anything miraculous. Thomas Jefferson had that sort of naturalistic mindset. He actually created a version of the New Testament where he physically cut out all of the miracles of Jesus, cut out all the resurrection, and he put it into a book called The Life and Morals of Jesus of Nazareth. You can buy it on Amazon if you want. That kind of doubting Thomas was very different than this doubting Thomas. This Thomas is a first century Jew. He comes from a worldview that completely believes that there's more to reality than just the materialistic. And more than that, he's been following Jesus for 3 years, and over again watching Jesus do miracle after miracle. Thomas isn't doubting that miracles are possible. No, the kind of doubt that Thomas has here comes from the deepest kind of disappointment.